Okay, so my name is Mike Metzger. Thanks for coming today. How many of you have heard anything about Payscale at all? Oh, wow. All right, well, I won't go into grand and glorious detail. We are a SaaS provider of compensation solutions to businesses. We've got about 6,000 customers. We've got about 400 employees. We've been in business for about 13 years. We collect our data using a website where individuals show up being curious about what they should be making, and a subset of those give us detailed information about how much they make in their roles, what their background is. They basically fill out kind of a virtual historical resume, and we use all that information to provide a very detailed, rich data set. My goal today is to convince everyone in this room, and I could probably do it one-on-one, but that you have one of the simplest, cheapest, frankly, easiest things you could do to get alignment and more engagement is to work on your compensation strategy as a company. It is, frankly, it's free found money, and every company should care about it because it is a big lever, right? I mean, if you think about most companies spend the vast majority of their OpEx is on their team. And if you're not doing that well, then you're kind of blowing good money after bad, so to speak. So my goal today is to talk about how building a compensation strategy and using that with your team ultimately results in higher levels of engagement, higher levels of retention, and better results for your business. Okay, so it's a great quote from Virgin Airlines. The headline here is that teams are what make our businesses go, right? Strategies alone without teams get no results. Businesses that have poor strategies, or I should say teams that are either untrained or not very well engaged are going to get mediocre results. And why does this matter more now than it did, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago? We believe it matters more now for two reasons, or two big trends. Trend number one is the nature of work, the nature of what it takes to produce and deliver value to the market has fundamentally changed over the last 20 years. And you all know this as well as I do. We're moving more towards knowledge-based. We're moving more towards a skills-based economy. And the nature of how you measure and reward changes as those changes occur. The second thing is, and yes, I'm going to talk about the millennials, the nature, the face of the workforce has changed or is changing, and millennials are playing a very key part of it. I think the one statistic I've seen on this is that within the next 3 to 4 years, millennials will make up more than 75% of the workforce. At Payscale, they make up more than 85% of our team. So why does this matter? Well, the millennials grew up in an era where there was the internet, where there was texting by phone, where fundamentally their communication style and approach is very different. And how does that impact companies? It impacts companies in how you communicate with them and fundamentally what their expectations are about what kind of information you're going to share with them and how that's used to increase their engagement and motivation and their alignment with company and company strategy. These two things together, changing nature of work and changing nature of the workforce, mean that companies actually have to change the way they've been communicating and doing compensation. So there's a lot of things that go into creating or making an employer's brand. Compensation is one of them. There's a whole host. Alignment with mission and vision, the underlying culture, the leadership, benefits and perks. But when you ask employees why they leave companies, still one of the top three, the top one continues to be manager. But within the top three, compensation is often cited. It is one of the top three reasons why people leave. And surprisingly, one of the challenges is that there is typically a gap, a perceived gap on the part of the employee in terms of how they're being paid and how they think they should be paid. And we see this, we run a survey off the back end of our, so we get 10 million uniques to our website every month. A subset of those go through a survey where they give us information about compensation. And on the back end of that, we also run some questions about engagement and about how much transparency there is in their company's approach to communicating around compensation and how fair they feel like they're being treated, and then how that impacts or affects engagement. I can send you this slide if you want, but you're welcome to take a photo of it. The headline here is, when you don't create a narrative, or when you don't control and deliver a narrative, employees fill in the blanks. And when they fill in the blanks, they often do it in a way which is not beneficial to the company. And so that's a great generalized statement, but what does it have to do with compensation? If you don't tell people how you pay and why you pay what you pay, ultimately they conclude that they're being paid below market. And the reality is we found that that about 80% of people are actually paid at market. And the way we know that is we ask them all about their background, and we know what the going market rate is, and they tell us what they're paid. So we know they're paid at market. But fully 40% of them think that they're paid below market, right? So the implication here is if companies were communicating about what the market is and about how they pay relative to market, you can pick up about 40% of goodwill from your employees. And the impact that the impact on an employee feeling like they're being paid fairly on their overall engagement in the company is a huge lever. So it's about a 30-point swing in terms of engagement between employees who feel like they're being paid fairly and their intent to stay, and employees who feel like they're not being paid fairly and their intent to leave. So creating and delivering a narrative is important. Our perspective is that compensation strategy ultimately is a core business strategy that your business goals are built on top of, right? For me, one of the metaphors I often use with people is a factory without an automation strategy would be considered crazy, right? A business that doesn't have a strategy that lays out how they're going to pay their key skill sets and how they compare to the labor markets that they think matter, it is like not having an automation strategy. It's absolutely crazy. And ultimately, the best compensation strategies provide for a high degree of alignment between business goals and the company goals. And as an example, I often use Payscale. Our stated compensation strategy is that we're going to pay our developers and our sales reps at 70% of the competitive market. So we define our market for both developers and sales as the Seattle market. We define our competition as Amazon and Microsoft and Google, which we don't compete with them, but we compete with them for talent. And we share that information with our team so that they know how we are going about compensation. For almost every other position, we pay at about the 50th percentile. We share that information with everybody. And that is a core, so the reason we created a compensation strategy that looks like that is we're about building innovative products, and we're about aggressively selling them. And so every company should have a compensation strategy, our view, and it should line up with their overall business goals and strategy. Turns out, lots of companies don't have a stated compensation strategy. Only about 37% of all companies do. The larger you go, the more there is a defined compensation strategy. The headline here is, if you don't actively create and build one, then you have an ad hoc, de facto or reactive strategy, which is you kind of are doing some variant of what you did last year, and it just evolves from that point forward. what is a compensation strategy, or what do you do to do that? You basically define the market, your labor market that you're competing for talent within, and you define where you want to be within that labor market, and then you evaluate how you're paying relative to that, and then ultimately you do some form of communication with your company. And in order for these things to work, there has to be a high degree of alignment between the executive team and the compensation strategy, and then you have to share that information with your line managers and ultimately some form of it with your team. We run every year a comp best practices survey. We run it typically in December and January. This year we got about 7,500 companies. It's a mix of customers and prospects and anybody who visits our website to participate. And so some of the data I'm showing you, like the last slide and this slide, are data that we pulled off of this survey. And one of the things that you have to do in order to do compensation strategy well is you have to decide what things you value as an organization and how you're going to pay for it. So, for example, top reasons for raises in 2016, 68% was performance, 42% was retention, 37% was market adjustments. It's different by company, and ultimately what you pay for needs to match your compensation strategy, needs to be very synergistic with your business goals and business strategy. Another thing that companies tend to pay attention to is, and this is important because your whole organization will know it, whether you communicate it or not, is how do you reward your highest performers? And think who at the company doesn't know what the top sales guys made last year and how they got it paid, right? Did they get a car? Did they go on a trip? Everybody knows it. The reason they know it is it gets communicated broadly. The reason it matters is it is very, it has baked into it what your organization cares about and values. So, in this slide, which I apologize, it's hard to read, the number one is base pay increases. This was in 2016. The number two was bonus. The number three was goal-based bonus. So the top three are all cash. The next four are non-monetary, top two being recognition. So these are how companies are rewarding their highest performers. There we go. The other key piece of a compensation strategy is communicating. A strategy that's created and kind of kept in a binder and not communicated at minimum to your executive team, communicated and ultimately have a high degree of buy-in, and then to your management team is frankly worthless because you can't execute against it. We see, and a big catchphrase now, at least in the compensation space, is transparency. And we see an increased, particularly with the millennial workforce, an increased need for transparency and communication around compensation. We see it as a spectrum. From one end there is virtually nothing at all, but on the other end is, and every now and then you hear about companies that are doing this, they're sharing everything. We are proponents of being towards this end of the scale, but not all the way up here. But it's a very company-specific thing, and ultimately the executive team should decide what level of transparency they want to achieve and how they want to communicate against that. But you need to communicate in order for a compensation strategy to be effective. 50% of the organizations we surveyed last year said that compensation drives employee engagement. So if you're trying to retain people, compensation matters. I probably shouldn't really even need to say that, but many of your organizations may have procured engagement software and things that people are using to try and increase overall retention. I would suggest before you do that, make sure you got your compensation in line. The last piece of the puzzle for us is, or from our perspective, is that the last mile of this compensation strategy, communication paradigm is the line manager. And the headline here is that the vast majority of conversations that happen about compensation are had by line managers, right? Your boots on the street managers are the ones that are having conversations with your team about compensation. And the challenge is we don't train them, we don't give them context, and frankly, we don't trust them. So they're kind of flying blind, which means, back to the earlier point, they make it up. So if you want to have consistent conversations about the context around why you pay what you pay and how you pay it, line managers are the place where the rubber meets the road. And unless you're intentional about that, it's really a mixed bag as to what you're getting. So for us, the headlines here are every company's got a pay brand. Your pay brand is made up of whatever, or is ultimately built on top of whatever your compensation strategy is and your communication strategy around that. Pay brand is very impactful on your employer brand, which ultimately drives both recruitment and retention. You gotta be intentional about creating a strategy, and you have to focus on your managers in terms of helping get that communicated. And with 5 minutes less, any questions you guys have? Not all at once. Yes. All right. Good. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Wait for the mic.
I don't even need a mic.
No,
right,
she wants you to speak into the mic.
I'm pretty loud at yelling. So one of the things that's great about Payscale is you also show if you get a specific skill, you get this much in bonus. Can you talk a little bit about how you measure that, especially for some of the soft skills?
Do you have a soft skill in mind?
I don't know if I have a soft skill in mind, but I think it's just, it's interesting just to see kind of.
Well, I'll tell you how we do it
yeah.
on hard skills.
Okay.
We just have enough data that if somebody comes through and they're a Ruby on Rails developer, or they're leveraging one of the new ops like Chef, and then we know their wage, and we see a lot of our system is algorithmic, so we see the incidence of some of these things coming through, and then we see the dollar difference in their wage, and we run, part of what we do on a quarterly basis is rerun our model and use it to determine what factors are most influential in comp, and then, so that's how we do it with hard skills. Soft, if you could give me an example.
Let's say leadership. So a lot of
Yeah, I mean, that's harder because it's both self-evaluated. Sorry, you're going to have to repeat that question.
a lot of times in job applications, for example, we do see some things like people management, leadership, ability to motivate. You see that in job postings as an ask. But one of the things before, this is from Vernon last mentioned that hard skills pay a lot more.
Yeah,
You could see
because you can measure them.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah.
Job postings say they want soft skills, but if you weren't getting trained,
Yeah.
where would you put your money? So that's kind of the impetus for the question.
We will report on any skills that people give us. Obviously, the hard skills are easier to verify and to calibrate. I think some of the work that LinkedIn's doing with their recommendation engine is trying to get at this. Whether that ends up being predictive or correlative, who knows? So, yes.
Mike, you mentioned, I think that you pay your developers 70%. I think was the figure that you used, relative to what they can earn at Google and Amazon, et cetera. The percentage, it's not even so much for me about the exact percentage.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you frame that information when you share it. Like, why would a developer feel
Versus
good about
100%?
that? And I'm sure there are some good reasons, but how do you frame that?
The way we describe it is that we define a labor market, and then we define the range for a given set of skills and position in that labor market. And that's all based on market data. And so then the average developer in Seattle, and they could be working at Microsoft or Google, would make at the 50th percentile. And we say our starting wage offer is at the 70th percentile. And then that's the start, and then the range that they have that they can move within in that particular role goes from that point forward. So we usually try and sell it as benefit. But interestingly enough, there's always this process to go through where when we're educating someone who's coming in or interviewing with us about that process, because it's not always as it can be sometimes counterintuitive. So, any other questions? Anybody going to the ball game tonight? Well, thank you.